You can buy your family a house, a car, and a life of luxury, but you can't buy their love. My name is Leah Wallace, and I learned this the hard way. It all started with a cold group video call, the Seattle rain lashing my windows. My mother, her face a mask of polite cruelty, told me not to come home for Thanksgiving. The reason I was a liability. I, the secret CEO, quietly funding their entire lifestyle, would embarrass them in front of my sister's new important boyfriend. They had no idea who he was, and they had no idea who I was. Join me for the full story. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The rain wasn't just falling, it was attacking. It hammered the windows of my apartment, a relentless, icy drumming that matched the migraine pulsing behind my eyes. This was Seattle in November. Gray on gray on gray. I was supposed to be celebrating. 2 days ago, ethos-driven, my company, my life had closed the landmark deal that would redefine our entire industry. I'd personally guided it sleepless for 72 straight hours. The result was a win that would be written about in financial journals for years, and a case of adrenal burnout so profound my doctor had ordered me off-grid for a week. My apartment, usually a chic minimalist sanctuary, felt more like a recovery room. Tea mugs, an empty bottle of melatonin, and a weighted blanket I'd been living under. I was scrolling through flight options to Medina, the wealthy bubble across the lake where I grew up. Home. The word tasted like ash. Thanksgiving was next week. For my mother Diane, it wasn't a holiday. It was her Super Bowl, a meticulously curated performative showcase for the Medina elite local titans, old money families, anyone who mattered. It was a pageant of status, and we were all her actors. I was usually cast as the prop, the quiet, vaguely artistic daughter, the reliable, boring one. I found a decent flight, my thumb hovering over the confirm button. The thought of the forced smiles, the conversational minefields, the sheer effort of it all made me want to crawl back under the blanket. But I'd missed the last 2 family events citing work. Skipping Thanksgiving would ignite a cold war I just didn't have the energy to fight. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It didn't just ring. It was a group video call request. My breath hitched. The Wallace family. My stomach didn't just drop. It clenched into a fist of ice. A group call was never good. It was never just checking in. A group call was an ambush. It was for interventions, for major announcements, for coordinated attacks. I stared at the screen, the 3 smiling faces from a family photo taken years ago mocking me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. Just decline, feign sleep, say your phone was off. But I knew it would just delay the inevitable. They would keep calling until I broke. With a shaking hand, I swiped to answer. Their faces populated the screen, a triptych of judgment. My mother Diane, perfectly coiffed, sitting in the formal living room, the one with the cream carpets we were never allowed to walk on. My father Robert beside her, looking stiffly at a spot just left of the camera, his discomfort a tangible thing. And my younger sister Chloe, lounging in an armchair, already looking bored, filing a perfect blood-red nail. Leah, my mother began. No hello, no how are you? Her voice was smooth, bright, and cold like polished marble. We're so glad we caught you. Hi Mom, Dad, Chloe. My voice was a croak. I cleared my throat. Is everything okay? Everything is wonderful, Diane said, her smile not touching her eyes. We're just finalizing the plans for Thanksgiving and it's a critically important year. I nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. Okay, I was just booking my flight. Chloe let out an exaggerated, impatient sigh. Mom, just tell her. Diane's smile tightened. Leah, honey, we need to talk about that. Your father and we've been talking and, we just think it's better if you don't come this year. The words hung in the air, unreal. The rain hammered the glass. What? What do you mean, don't come? I already bought a hostess gift. It was a stupid thing to say, but my brain had stalled. Chloe sat up, her face filling her little window, her voice a syrupy, condescending drawl. Look, Leah, I'm bringing my new boyfriend home. His name is Nathan Reed, and he is seriously important. Okay, I said slowly, trying to process the non sequitur. That's great. I'm happy for you. I'm looking forward to meeting him. No, you don't get it, Chloe snapped, dropping the fake pity. He's not like anyone you know. He's not local. He runs in circles you just wouldn't understand. He's used to successful people. She looked me up and down, even through the screen, taking in my messy bun and worn sweater. We can't have him asking what you do. A cold dread sharper than my migraine was spreading through my chest. I looked to my mother, my silent plea for sanity. Chloe is right, dear, Diane said, her voice softening into the tone she used just before the killing blow. This is a new level for our family. Nathan is exceptional. And she paused, searching for the word, situation. It's a liability, dear. We can't risk you embarrassing us. It's just for this 1 year, until you get things sorted out. My situation. The situation where I ran a multi-million-dollar ethics consultancy. The situation where I was at 28, one of the most respected anonymous voices in my field. The situation where I quietly paid the second mortgage on the very house they were sitting in. My father said nothing. He just stared at that spot on the wall, his silence a deafening chorus of agreement. I see, I managed to whisper. Good, Diane chirped, relief flooding her face. I knew you'd understand. You were always the practical one. The call ended. The screen went black. I sat there in the silence, the sound of the rain rushing back in to fill the void. The word echoed louder than the storm. Liability. My eyes drifted to a silver frame on my mantel. It was a photo from 2 summers ago, the 4 of them on a yacht in the Mediterranean. My father raising a champagne glass, my mother's arm draped over Chloe, all of them smiling, radiant. A trip I had paid for. A trip I had worked through and couldn't attend. Liability, I whispered to the empty room. The word wasn't just an insult, it was a verdict. And it was a knife I hadn't even seen coming. The numbness of the call didn't last. It was a flimsy shield that shattered within minutes, leaving behind the familiar hollow ache of sorrow. This wasn't the sharp pain of a new wound. It was the chronic throb of an old one. Liability. It was a new word, a crueler one. But the sentiment was ancient. It was the background radiation of my entire life, the foundational truth of being the Wallace family's practical one. I sank onto my sofa, the rain-lashed window blurring into a watercolor of gray. It wasn't just that they had uninvited me, it was how they had done it with such casual, dismissive ease. It was the confirmation that my role in the family was not one of love, but of function. The memory was so clear it could have been yesterday, my 24th birthday. I was living in a tiny studio apartment in Capitol Hill, surviving on instant noodles and a manic electric energy. I hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours. My desk was a graveyard of empty coffee mugs, my whiteboard a frantic spiderweb of equations and code. Then at 3:17 a.m. I'd done it. I'd hit compile, and it worked. The framework, the core logic for a system that could audit corporate AI for bias, not just after the fact, but in real time. It was revolutionary. It was the birth of ethos-driven. My hands were shaking and I was vibrating with a joy so pure it felt like I might levitate. I had to tell someone. I called home. My mother answered, her voice thick with sleep. Leah, it's the middle of the night. Is something wrong? No, Mom, no, something's right. I was half laughing, half crying. I did it. The platform, the one I've been telling you about. I built it. It works. A heavy sigh came through the receiver. Leah, I can't talk about your little computer project right now. It's an absolute crisis here. My euphoria vanished, replaced by a cold spike of panic. What is Dad? Okay. Is Chloe? It's Chloe, she cut in, her voice dropping. She's devastated. Just hysterical. That new restaurant on Main Street towed her car. I blinked. Towed? That's the crisis. Don't be glib, Leah, she snapped. She's heartbroken. Your father is trying to calm her down. Robert got on the line, his voice gruff. Leah, your sister is beside herself. This is a real-life problem. We just don't have the headspace for your whatever it is right now. There was a pause. Listen, we're a little tight this month. Can you wire us some money for the impound fee? You've always been so good with money. I wired the money. I always wired the money. I hung up the phone and stared at the lines of code on my screen, the code that I knew would change my life, and I felt about 2 inches tall. That was the moment it was all set in stone. I wasn't a daughter. I was a utility. Chloe was the treasure, a delicate, sparkling thing to be protected and admired. I was the plumbing invisible essential and only ever noticed when I failed to function. My reliability wasn't a virtue. It was my curse. They still thought I had a little computer project. They had no idea. Ethos-driven wasn't a project. It was a silent giant. We were the anonymous essential ethics auditors for half of the Fortune 100. My clients didn't know my name, and my family didn't know my job. I was L.M. Wallace, the enigmatic founder who only communicated through encrypted channels, whose COO was the public face of the company. I'd built this wall of anonymity for one stupid, childish reason: I wanted my family to love Leah. The quiet daughter. The practical one. I didn't want them to love L.M. Wallace, the CEO. I didn't want to be an ATM. I just wanted to be a daughter. It seemed I had failed on both counts. They didn't love Leah. They were ashamed of her, and they were already treating me like an ATM. The rage, when it finally came, was hot and sharp. I stood up, the blanket pooling at my feet, the bitter, choking irony of it all. My father's shrewd investments that allowed him to retire early and start his laughable consulting firm. That was me, a monthly wire transfer of $20,000 to keep his ego afloat. The Medina house they were so proud of, the one they were worried I'd embarrass them in, I had paid off the $1.2 million second mortgage in a single lump sum last year, routed through a blind LLC. They'd celebrated it as a bank error in their favor. And Chloe, God, Chloe, her entire influencer lifestyle. The luxury apartment downtown, the brand new Tesla, the vlogging trips to Bali and Dubai, all of it. Funded by me, by the liability. They were uninviting me from a party I was paying for to impress a man they hoped would give Chloe the very lifestyle I was already giving her. The injustice was so profound, so suffocating, I felt my hands clench into fists. My laptop open on the coffee table pinged. An email notification lit up the darkening room. I walked over, my mind still a maelstrom of betrayal and fury. The subject line was innocuous. It was from my head of HR. Subject: onboarding complete, Nathan Reed. My blood didn't just turn to ice, it evaporated. Nathan Reed, Chloe's seriously important boyfriend. It couldn't be. My fingers shaking again, but this time with something else entirely, flew across the trackpad. I opened the email. My fingers were frozen on the trackpad. It was a common name. It had to be. Reed. Nathan Reed. But my gut, that cold, hollow pit in my stomach that had saved me in a dozen boardrooms, already knew. I clicked the attached personnel file, and there he was. A professional headshot. Sharp jaw, intelligent eyes, a faint, confident smile. The same man from Chloe's Instagram stories, the one she'd panned over just last week, captioning it, "My brilliant man." Nathan Reed, age 32, poached from a top-tier competitor, my new head of strategy, the shark I had personally spent the last 3 months reeling in, the man I had just authorized a staggering, life-changing compensation package for, a package that was more than my father had ever earned in a single year. He was without a doubt the most important hire Ethos-driven had made all year. He was the reason I was so burned out. I hired him. The realization was a physical shock, like touching a live wire. I leaned back, my mind racing, replaying the interviews. 3 rounds. Grueling, high-stakes intellectual combat. We had debated ethics, market projections, and the future of AI. But he had never seen me. Not Leah Wallace. He had seen L.M. Wallace. He had spoken to a voice in a secure video call, a professionally lit, imposing figure. For high-level hires, I never used my apartment. I used my dedicated home office, a small leased studio I kept across town, a place that existed for one reason: to be the face of L.M. Wallace. The background was a tastefully blurred wall of awards and leather-bound books on philosophy and code. He knew my mind. He knew my authority. He knew the disembodied, powerful entity who had just become his boss. He had never seen the liability in a faded college sweatshirt hair, in a messy bun recovering from exhaustion. He had no idea. My arrogant, status-obsessed family, who believed I worked a sad little office job, was uninviting me from my own house to impress my own employee. The sheer cosmic absurdity of it almost made me laugh. It was a hysterical, brittle sound that died in my throat. They were terrified the liability would meet the asset, not realizing they were the same person. My phone lit up on the table, yanking me from my thoughts. A new text. It was Diane. "Leah, you're making this so difficult. You're being selfish. This is Chloe's one chance at a real future. Please don't ruin this for her." Ruin this. Selfish. The words were so spectacularly unjust, so completely inverted from reality that they barely registered. I was being selfish. I, who had just last month wired Chloe $5,000 for a vlogging trip that she never took. I, who had paid for my father's new must-have luxury sedan just because he was feeling down. I, who had never asked for a single thing in return except maybe to be seen. Before I could even process Diane's message, another one came through. A notification bubble from Chloe. "Just confirming you're not coming. If you show up, I'll literally have security remove you. Don't be more pathetic than you already are." Pathetic. That was the word that did it. Not liability, not selfish. Pathetic. The sorrow that had been sitting like a stone in my chest didn't disappear. It crystallized. It hardened the pressure, transforming it from a soft, grieving mass into something sharp, cold, and clear. A diamond. They had mistaken my quietness for weakness. They had mistaken my generosity for an obligation. They had mistaken my privacy for shame. This wasn't just an unkindness. This was erasure. The fog of my burnout, the lingering ache of my grief, it all evaporated, burned away by this new cold fire. This was no longer just a family betrayal. It was an attack on my identity. It was an attack on the very thing I had built from nothing, the thing I had sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my sanity for. They weren't just dismissing Leah. They were dismissing the mind that had built an empire, the mind that Nathan Reed himself had called visionary just last week on our call. My agency, that dormant, exhausted part of me, snapped awake. I wasn't the victim. I wasn't the liability. I was the CEO, and I was done being their secret. I stood up, my spine straight for the first time in days. I looked at the glowing screen of my laptop, at Nathan Reed's file. Then I looked at my phone, at Chloe's sneering, vicious text. "Don't be more pathetic than you already are." A slow, cold smile spread across my face. The kind of smile I got right before I won a hostile negotiation. My fingers moved, typing a simple reply to Chloe. "Don't worry, I wouldn't dream of missing it." I hit send. The delivered receipt appeared almost instantly. The trap was set. The shift inside me was palpable. The sorrow didn't vanish. It was a deep, permanent bruise, but it was no longer in charge. The fog of my burnout, the paralyzing grief of their rejection, it all receded. In its place, the cold, sharp focus of the CEO returned. This was no longer a family problem. They had involved my company. They had called my life's work pathetic. They had designated me a liability. I was about to show them just how liable I could be. I wasn't a victim. I was an executive, and they had just made a catastrophic amateur hour mistake. I went to my laptop and pulled Nathan Reed's personnel file from our secure server. I'd read it a dozen times during the hiring process, but now I was studying it not as a hiring manager, but as a strategist conducting opposition research. The story it told was exactly what I'd sensed during our interviews. He wasn't old money. He was the absolute opposite. He'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Tacoma, father a mechanic, mother a school bus driver. He'd gotten into Stanford on a full academic scholarship and had declawed his way up the corporate ladder at our competitor with nothing but raw talent and a relentless grinding work ethic. My family, with their borrowed prestige and rented lifestyle, would see him as a symbol of the class they so desperately wanted to join. They were blind. They couldn't see that he was a mirror of me, not them. He was a builder. They were tenants. I scrolled down to the personal statement he'd submitted with his application, a section I always found revealing. A single line, one I'd noted at the time, but which now seemed to glow on the screen, jumped out at me. I have no patience for unearned arrogance or those who mistake privilege for merit. A slow, cold smile, the one my COO called my deal-closing smile, touched my lips. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. My sister, the aspiring influencer, who had never worked a real day in her life, had snagged a self-made man who despised everything she stood for. My parents, obsessed with appearing prominent, were about to put on a grand performance of unearned arrogance for a man who would in all likelihood be repulsed by it. They were trying to impress him with their status, a status I had secretly purchased for them. The trap wasn't something I needed to build. It was already there, ticking. The truth was the trap. All I had to do was spring it. My old plan was to just show up. My new plan was different. I wasn't just going to arrive. I was going to arrive. I picked up my phone. My fingers were steady. The CEO was in charge now. I made 3 calls. The first was to my corporate attorney. "David," I said, my voice calm and low, "I need you to draw up a full, itemized, and notarized accounting of the Wallace Family Discretionary Fund. Yes, the discretionary one. I want a complete list of all expenditures for the last 5 years. Mortgage payments, cash transfers, medical bills, car leases, tuition, everything. And David, I want it bound in black leather. I'll need a hard copy delivered to me by tomorrow afternoon." He didn't ask why. He simply said, "Yes, Ms. Wallace." The second call was to my executive assistant. "Anya," I said, "I need you to book me a suite at the Grand Hotel in Medina. Presidential suite. Check in today. Check out Friday." There was a half-second pause on her end. "Not at home, Ms. Wallace." "No, Anya, not at home. And I need a car service, not a taxi, a black Maybach S-Class. It will pick me up at 100 p.m. sharp on Thanksgiving Day." "Understood," she said, her voice its usual unflappable self. The third call was to my head of PR, Cynthia Davies. Cynthia was a social shark, and she knew the Medina ecosystem better than anyone. "Cynthia, happy early Thanksgiving," I said, injecting warmth into my voice. "Are you by any chance attending the Wallace's big party tomorrow, Diane's annual showcase?" I heard her smile. "Of course, wouldn't miss it. It's the event of the season." "Wonderful," I said. "I'm planning to make a brief appearance myself, just wanted to let you know." Her interest was piqued. I could hear it. "Leah, at your mother's, this is news." "Just be there, Cynthia," I said. "I have a feeling you'll find it newsworthy." The night before Thanksgiving, the frantic, furious calls started at 8:00 p.m., an hour after my text to Chloe. I was in the presidential suite at the Grand. It was spacious, beautiful, and looked out over the glittering hostile lights of the town I'd escaped. My phone buzzed on the marble nightstand, a furious, vibrating insect. I let each call go to voicemail. Voicemail 1. My mother, high-pitched and panicky. "Leah? What did you mean by that text? You cannot be serious. I am forbidding you from coming to this house. You will ruin everything." Voicemail 2. Chloe, whispering, incoherent with rage. "If you show up here tomorrow, I swear to God I will have you arrested for trespassing. You are trying to sabotage me because you're a jealous, pathetic." Voicemail 3. My father, gruff, angry, and terrified. "Leah, I don't know what game you're playing, but your mother is in tears. You have ruined Thanksgiving with this stunt. Do not come here. I mean it. We won't let you in." I put my phone on silent. I sipped a glass of still water, my mind perfectly, beautifully clear. A hotel courier had knocked on my door an hour earlier. On the desk, illuminated by a single lamp, sat a heavy, imposing document bound in flawless black leather. The Wallace Family Discretionary Fund, a 5-year accounting. The trap was set. The bomb was built. Now I just had to light the fuse. I slept for exactly 4 hours, a deep, dreamless void. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to cut through the gray Seattle overcast. It was Thanksgiving Day. I didn't feel tired. I felt cold, clear, and utterly calm. The burnout was gone, burned away by pure, undiluted adrenaline. I spent the morning in the hotel's gym, then took a long, hot shower. At noon, I began to prepare. This wasn't about getting dressed. This was about arming myself. I laid the suit out on the king-sized bed. It was a custom piece I'd had made in Milan, a dark emerald green silk wool blend. It wasn't flashy. It was severe. It was the kind of suit that was so understated its price was only recognizable to those who truly understood wealth. It whispered power. It didn't shout it. I pulled my hair back into a tight polished chignon at the nape of my neck, the style I always used for hostile negotiations. Minimal makeup, just enough to sharpen my features. When I looked in the mirror, Leah Wallace, the mopey practical daughter, was gone. Staring back at me was L.M. Wallace, the founder of Ethos Driven. They were expecting the liability. They were about to meet the asset. I picked up the heavy black leather-bound report from the desk. It felt solid in my hand. My weapon. At 12:55 p.m. my phone buzzed. "Your car is waiting, Ms. Wallace." I went downstairs. The black Maybach was idling at the curb, a silent obsidian shark among the Ubers and taxis. The driver, a professional in a dark suit, held the door for me. The interior was silent, smelling of new leather. The drive to Medina was quiet, a 20-minute journey across the bridge into the bubble. As we glided through the pristine, tree-lined streets, I saw the house. My childhood home. It was buzzing. The circular driveway was already clogged with a collection of high-end BMWs, Teslas, and a vintage Porsche. This wasn't a family dinner. This was as my mother intended the event. I could see through the large bay windows the house was packed. I recognized the gray-haired figure of the mayor. I saw the sleek, silver-haired editor of the Medina Gazette holding a champagne flute. I saw two of my father's supposed business rivals, titans of local real estate. My mother had succeeded. She had gathered her entire community, her audience, to witness her performative triumph, to witness Chloe's brilliant catch. My stomach didn't flutter. It was a block of ice. The car glided to a perfect stop at the base of the stone walkway. The driver opened my door. I stepped out holding the leather report at my side. I walked up the path, my heels clicking on the flagstones, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the muffled party noise. I didn't knock. I rang the doorbell. A burst of laughter and music spilled out as the door was pulled open. It was my father, Robert. His face was flushed with champagne and holiday cheer, his smile wide, ready to greet another important guest. When he saw me, the smile didn't fade. It cracked and fell from his face. His skin, already ruddy, went a blotchy purple red of pure rage. "I told you," he hissed, his voice a low, furious growl, blocking the doorway with his body. "You are not welcome here. Get off my property." "I'm just dropping something off, Dad," I said, my voice calm and even. "I said get out," he snarled, taking a step toward me. "Robert, who is it?" My mother's voice, bright and theatrical, trilled from the foyer. She appeared behind him, her smile plastered on her eyes, scanning the driveway for the next important arrival. When she saw me, her smile froze, then tightened into a venomous mask. "You," she whispered, her voice shaking. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into the sleeve of my suit. "Get out. Get out right now. You are ruining this. Nathan is here." "What is going on, Chloe?" She pushed past both of them, resplendent in a gaudy gold-sequined dress that was entirely too much for one in the afternoon. Her face, a heavy mask of foundation and contour, twisted when she saw me. "Oh my God!" she shrieked loud enough for the guests in the living room to turn their heads. "Dad, call the police. I told you I'd have her arrested. She's obsessed with me. She can't stand to see me happy." She was performing, This was her moment. She turned her back to me, speaking loudly over her shoulder to someone just inside the living room archway. "It's just my sister, Nathan," she called out, her voice dripping with a false, pitying sweetness. "The one I told you about, she's having a bit of an episode. She's just so jealous." And then he stepped out. Nathan Reed. He moved from the living room into the foyer, a half-empty glass of champagne in his hand, a polite, awkward, "I'm so sorry, your family is crazy" smile fixed on his face, ready to appease his girlfriend's crazy sister. He looked at my parents, at a wailing Chloe, and then his eyes locked with mine. The smile didn't just fade, it shattered. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a chalky sheet white. His glass halfway to his mouth stopped and began to tremble, champagne sloshing over the rim onto his hand. His eyes widened, not in confusion, but in dawning, abject horror. He wasn't seeing Leah, the pathetic, struggling sister. He was seeing the blurred, authoritative figure from a dozen secure video calls. "L.M." He stammered, his voice a strangled whisper that was suddenly terrifyingly loud in the silent foyer. "Ms. Wallace, what are you doing here?" The foyer didn't just get quiet, it ceased to exist. Sound, air, and light seemed to bend and warp around Nathan's words. The only noise in the universe was the faint, tinny sound of a jazz piano track playing from the living room, suddenly obscene in its cheerfulness. My father, his hand still half raised to shove me, was frozen in a grotesque tableau of aggression. My mother's grip on my arm went slack, her fingers sliding off my suit as if I were suddenly white-hot. Chloe's mouth was still open, her face a mask of utter, uncomprehending confusion. They all swiveled their heads in a three-part harmony of disbelief, staring at Nathan, their minds a buffering wheel, trying and failing to compute what he'd just said. "Ms. Wallace." It was Chloe who broke the spell. She let out a high-pitched, hysterical laugh that sounded like a strangled bird. "What?" she shrieked, batting her mascara-laden eyelashes at him, a desperate, flailing attempt to regain control of the scene. "Nathan, what did you just call her?" "Don't be silly." She waved a dismissive sequined hand at me, her gaze darting between him and me. "This is just Leah, my sister, the one I told you about. Remember, the one who's struggling." "Struggling?" Nathan repeated the word, his voice flat, dead. He looked from Chloe's grinning, painted, terrified face to me in my dark, severe suit, my expression unreadable. The dawning horror on his face was absolute as the pieces clicked into place. He realized he hadn't just been caught in a family spat. He'd been played. He'd been lied to by his girlfriend. He'd been made a fool of. And he'd just stood there complicit, while his new CEO was being verbally abused by her own family. "Struggling," he said again, and this time his voice was low, cold, and dangerous. "Chloe." He took an involuntary step back from her as if she were toxic. "Ms. Wallace, Ms. L.M. Wallace, is the founder and CEO of Ethos Driven." He looked at me, his face pale, his eyes a mixture of professional deference and sheer unadulterated panic. She's my boss." My boss. The words detonated in the silence, a concussive blast that sucked all the air out of the room. My mother let out a tiny, choked sound. My father stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the wall hard. Chloe's face went from confusion to a pasty, slack-jawed white beneath her heavy spray tan. "No," she whispered. "No. No, he's lying. She works at a..." She looked at me, her eyes wild with a feral panic. "Tell them, Leah. Tell them you're a secretary or something." I finally moved. I stepped past my frozen family, out of the dark, shadowed doorway, and into the warm, bright light of the crystal chandelier in the foyer. I felt the heat of every eye in the house on me. My voice when I spoke wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was quiet, calm, and it cut through the silence like a scalpel. "She's right, Nathan," I said, my gaze steady on his. "I've struggled." I turned my head slowly, my gaze landing on my father. He was staring at me, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "I've struggled, Dad," I said, my voice never wavering. "I've really struggled to pay off the $1.2 million second mortgage on this house. The one you told all your friends was a shrewd investment finally paying off." I looked at my mother. She was shaking her head, a tiny, repetitive, negative motion, her eyes wide with terror. "No, no, no," she whispered. "I've struggled, Mom," I continued just as calmly. "I struggled to fund this entire party. The caterers, the valets, the thousands of dollars in champagne that Nathan is holding. I've struggled to fund your charity foundation, the one that hasn't hosted a single event in 3 years, but seems to pay for your entire wardrobe." And finally, I turned to Chloe. She had backed herself into the wall, her gold sequins scraping against the plaster, her hands held up as if to ward off a blow. She looked small and cheap and utterly terrified. "And I have really struggled, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping. "I have struggled to pay for your downtown apartment, your Tesla, your vlogging trips to Dubai and Bali, your entire life." A gasp, sharp and collective, came from the living room archway. I glanced over. The jazz music had finally stopped. The guests were no longer pretending not to listen. They were standing in a silent, transfixed crowd. The mayor, the local real estate titans, and right at the front, my head of PR, Cynthia, watching with a look of pure, fascinated horror. And beside her, the silver-haired editor of the Medina Gazette, her mouth agape. They had heard it. They had heard everything. My mother, seeing them, seeing her entire social world watching her execution, let out a small, strangled sob. I turned back to the foyer table, the antique mahogany piece where my mother always displayed the guest book. I held up the black leather-bound folder. "I brought you a gift," I said, my voice resonating in the dead tomb-like silence. I placed it on the table. It landed not with a crash, but with a soft, heavy, definitive thud. "It's an itemized receipt for the last 5 years of my struggles. Every wire transfer, every car lease, every bill, every single dollar I spent keeping this performance alive." I looked at the three of them, my broken, exposed, parasitic family. "I'm closing the account. Happy Thanksgiving." The thud of the leather-bound report on the antique table was a period, a final, definitive end to the sentence. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, heavy and suffocating. It lasted for 3 full seconds before Chloe finally broke. It wasn't a sob. It wasn't a cry. It was a scream. A raw, animalistic, guttural sound of pure, narcissistic rage that ripped from her throat. It was the sound of a cornered animal, a sound of pure, unadulterated loss. "No!" she shrieked, her face splotchy and contorted, turning on our father. "She's lying! Tell them, Dad! Tell them she's lying! Make her stop!" But Robert was mute, a statue of his own shame, his face the color of wet cement. While Chloe descended into hysterics, Nathan moved. He was all business. He placed his champagne flute on the mantel with a sharp, definitive click. His face was grim, carved from stone. He looked only at me, his eyes filled with a mortified professional horror. "Ms. Wallace," he said, his voice low and steady. I clearly lack the words. I have made a catastrophic error in judgment, both personally and by association. I need to tender my resignation, effective immediately." I held up a single hand. The gesture was small, but it stopped him cold. "Your personal life is your own, Mr. Reed," I said, my voice just as cool, cutting through my sister's wails. "Your professional one is mine. We'll discuss it on Monday." A flicker of something, relief maybe, or just shock, crossed his face. He gave a single sharp nod. "Monday." He didn't look at Chloe. He didn't look at my parents. He walked to the hall closet, grabbed his coat, and walked straight toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous, silent foyer. Chloe, seeing him leave, lunged from the wall, her gold sequins flashing. "Nathan." "No, don't go. Don't leave me. She's doing this. She's ruining it. She ruined it. He didn't pause. He didn't slow down. He pulled the front door open, walked out into the daylight, and closed it quietly behind him. The snick of the latch sounded like a gunshot. Chloe's wail turned into a dry, gasping sob as she slid down the wall, her gold dress catching on the rough plaster, a crumpled, glittering heap of ruin. My father, Robert, was speechless, gray-faced, leaning heavily against the wall. He looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. But it was my mother who held my gaze. Diane wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, her eyes wide with a dawning terror that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with reputation. She was watching her audience. I followed her gaze. The guests, they were staring. Not just staring, but gaping in a way that violated all of Medina's polite social codes. They were staring with a mixture of raw pity and, worse, a sort of fascinated, delicious disgust. I saw the mayor quietly slip his phone back into his pocket, and beside him the silver-haired editor of the Gazette, that social shark. She was no longer just observing. She was taking notes, her pen flying across a small notebook she'd pulled from her purse. My mother saw it too. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth, the sound of faint, dying breath. "Oh my God, Robert, they heard." I looked back at the three of them, the three broken, exposed, hollow people who had built their lives on my silence. My father speechless with shame, my mother destroyed by social ruin, my sister weeping on the floor. The anger was gone, the cold resolve was gone. All I felt was a vast, cold emptiness. This was it, the final scene. "You wanted me gone," I said, my voice just loud enough to carry to them. "You got your wish." I turned my back on them. "You just lost your liability." I walked to the door Nathan had just closed. I didn't slam it. I pulled it open and walked out into the cold, clean November air. The Maybach was waiting, a black void in the bright afternoon. The driver, his face impassive, held the door. I got in. The door closed with a solid, definitive, impossibly heavy thud, sealing me inside. The car began to move, gliding silently, smoothly away from the curb. I didn't look back. I stared straight ahead, watching the pristine, manicured lawns of my childhood neighborhood slide past the tinted glass. Only then, once the house was out of sight, did I let out the breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire adult life. It came out in a ragged, shuddering gasp. The triumph was there, a sharp, metallic taste in my mouth, but it was tangled inextricably with a profound, aching sorrow that felt bottomless. The family I had been trying to save, the family I had been trying to buy, had been a phantom all along. I hadn't just exposed them, I had orphaned myself. A single hot tear traced a path down my cold cheek. And for the first time in my life, I realized that was okay. Freedom isn't free. Sometimes it costs you everything you thought you loved. The fallout was, as Cynthia later described it, a social carpet bombing. The Medina Gazette ran a story the following Sunday, a masterpiece of polite, vicious insinuation titled, "A Philanthropic Facade, the Cost of Keeping Up Appearances." It never mentioned the Wallace name, but it didn't have to. It detailed an unfortunate Thanksgiving incident involving a prominent local family and their long-lost, quietly successful daughter. The Medina elite, terrified of being associated with the fraud, evaporated from my family's life overnight. The Wallaces were pariahs. My lawyers, acting on my behalf through the blind LLC that held the note, began the foreclosure proceedings. The house, the stage for all my mother's performances, was sold at auction 3 months later. My father and Diane, socially and financially ruined, moved to a small, respectable 55-plus community condo in Boca Raton. I had my lawyers arrange the purchase, paid in full. It was clean, safe, and modest. It was more grace than they had ever shown me. The letters started arriving, forwarded by my legal team. First they were angry, full of threats and demands. Then they were pleading. Then finally just sad, confused scrawls from my father. I had them filed. Unread. Chloe. I heard from Cynthia, had it the worst. Her influencer career built entirely on a foundation of my money vanished when the money did. The Tesla was repossessed. The downtown apartment leased to someone else. She was at last report working as a part-time administrative assistant for a dental practice in Renton. And Nathan. He and I had that video call the following Monday. It was the most awkward, brutal, and honest conversation I'd ever had with an employee. He was mortified professionally and personally. "I can't stay in Seattle, Ms. Wallace," he'd said, his face pale. "The association." I'd cut him off. "I wasn't planning on you staying. Your judgment in your personal life was flawed, but your professional talent is exceptional. How do you feel about London?" I made him head of European strategy, a massive promotion, and a clean slate an ocean away from the gossip. He was thriving, and I'd discovered, profoundly and unshakably loyal. 6 months later. It was Memorial Day, the unofficial start of summer. I was on the rooftop deck of my new home. Not the sterile anonymous apartment, but a light-filled warm craftsman in Queen Anne with a sprawling deck that looked out over the city and the Sound. The deck was loud, messy, and packed. My COO Mike was at a massive grill arguing with my head of engineering about flare-ups. My old college roommate, the one who'd let me sleep on her couch when I was coding the first iteration of Ethos, was telling a story way too loudly to a group of my junior developers. Even Nathan, in town for a quarterly review, was here leaning against the railing, with a beer, looking relaxed for the first time I'd ever seen him. This was my real community. My real family. 2 months ago, I had done the cover story for Forbes. The secret was out. L.M. Wallace was gone, and Leah Wallace, the public's celebrated CEO, was here. Mike shoved a paper plate with a perfectly grilled burger into my hand. "To the boss," he yelled over the music. I laughed, catching my reflection in the sliding glass door. My hair was down, I was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, and I looked happy. I wasn't the utility, I wasn't the liability, I was just Leah. I looked out at the chaos, the genuine affection, the sound of real laughter. My old family, I thought, was obsessed with appearing important. My new family, they're just present. Nathan caught my eye from across the deck and raised his bottle in a silent toast. I raised mine back. I raised my glass, my name, my full name. Leah Wallace, echoing in the air, carried on a wave of laughter, and for the first time in my entire life, I was completely and unapologetically home. As Leah raised her glass, she didn't just find a new community, she finally closed the door on her old life. What a powerful transformation. We're eager to hear your thoughts on this story, so leave a comment below. We read every single one. Be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Yesterday. We'll see you next time.